All right, welcome back, everybody. And you can all see my slides, right? You can see my screen. Cool, just making sure. Awesome. Let's talk about this as a larger group, and I will randomize some volunteers, but feel free to bump to a classmate if you're not sure. Or if you feel that the bot has called on you 6 times in a row, feel free to bump to a friend. Kevin, can you give me one of the things that CRUD stands for? Just one of these 4. Do we have a Kevin?
Sorry, I was
no,
muted.
You're okay.
The C stands for create.
Okay, great.
It's related to the post verb.
Awesome. Yeah, and we will talk more about the verbs that they relate to as we go on, but if you know it, feel free to share it. Thanks, Kevin. Let me get someone else for another one of these CRUD abbreviations. What is another one of these things that CRUD stands for? Alexander. Oh, nope. Do that again. Have an Alexander. Click. Galen.
So the R stands for read.
Read. Awesome. Thank you. Let's do someone else. Let's hear from Wyatt.
Update.
Sure. Cool, thank you. And one more for CRUD. Andrew Smith.
Yeah, that's delete.
Awesome. So these are the actions that we can perform on resources. Let's move on and talk a little bit about HTTP verbs. Did we hear from Jahara? What's one of our common 5 HTTP verbs?
Patch.
Sorry, did you say patch?
I said patch.
Cool. Thank you. All right, let's get another one from Logan.
Get.
Get, okay. Cool, thanks. I don't think Dougie's here right now. Yeah, I don't think so. Aiden, another HTTP verb?
Post.
Post, great. I always forget I don't have that command. Call on, let's hear from Brisa, another HTTP verb?
Delete.
Delete. Cool, and we have one more. Austin?
I knew it. Put. Awesome,
thanks. Cool. Yeah, small differences between patch and put, which we'll have lots of chances to discuss. Cool. Let me think about this here for a second. Yeah, let's talk about how these map to each other, the HTTP verbs and the CRUD actions. And for this, I'll take a volunteer. I think this is a good place to put it. What do each of these map to? Does anybody want to volunteer and talk about which CRUD action the patch verb would map to? Joey H.
That is update.
Update, awesome. Looks like we also had a hand raised from Claudia.
Well, I was going to say that, but
Okay.
Get transfers to the read.
Read, awesome. Looks good. And then for these other 3, any other volunteers? Or if anybody just wants to, okay, go ahead, Olivia.
Put is update. So is patch.
Yep. Awesome, thanks. I'll take one more volunteer to talk about post and delete. Joe R.
Yeah, for
2 for
delete,
1.
it should be destroy, I think.
Yep. Hey, what about post?
Post should be edit.
Not quite.
Edit, it's not update because there's already taken. Yeah, I'm not sure.
No worries, we'll bump to a friend. I think Logan, you had your hand raised.
Yes, I'm pretty sure it's create.
Post maps to create. Yep, exactly. So before we move on, just to acknowledge, this is kind of a lot of memorization, just a lot of terminology and repetition that we're going through. That's kind of why this is the warm up for today. These relate really closely to the concept of REST and the convention that is REST. So it's just a lot of, it's a good warm up because this is knowledge we have to have in order to kind of put REST into action in our apps. So yeah, exactly. Thank you for sharing out your answers for those and discussing them together. We'll move on to talking about URIs next. Yeah, so let's talk about, for this URL, the task manager. I'm gonna make this just a little bit bigger because it's actually even hard for me to see here. Let's see, in this URL, what is the URI? And I'll randomize a couple of these as well. Ryan?
So the URI would be starting after the M at the com, the .com, and it would end the W before the question mark.
Right, the part of new. Yep, that's exactly right. So for our URI, in this example, we have /task/new. And that's where our, well, yeah, we'll say that's where our URI ends. Let's do another volunteer for the protocol. Which part of this example is the protocol, Jennifer?
I am pleading the fifth and bumping.
Totally cool. Let's phone a friend. Call on Joe M. What would be the protocol for this URL?
Sure, that's the HTTP.
Mm-hmm. And technically, I think we could also, you could say
the colon and yes.
Yeah, exactly. The important thing to remember though is that the HTTP is the protocol. It's yeah, and this would be included in that. But when we talk about the protocol, we can think HTTP or HTTPS. Cool, thank you. I'll take a volunteer for these last two. What is the domain? If anybody wants to raise their hand. Cool, Ksenia?
I'll try herokuapp.com.
Yeah, that's a great stab at it. That's right. And I would say actually we could include everything between the protocol and the URI. Everything in between those two would be considered the domain. So up into and including the .com. So that was good. Let's put this in quotes. So task manager. That's the domain. We're running out of space here on our slides, but I'll take one more volunteer for what is the query string in this example? Kevin?
The query string is everything after the question mark. So it's title equals new task equals task, and it stops at the pound.
Yeah, exactly. It'll stop at the pound sign. So that'll be the question mark. And then we have our query params, or our query string. It's always going to be set up in key value pairs. So here we have title equals new, and then we separate it with that ampersand, and we'll say task equals task. And that is where our query string ends. And then this is an anchor in case anybody isn't familiar. This will just, whenever you see a pound sign after the query params like this in a URL, it will scroll to a particular part of the page. So not super important to remember that right now. And really all of this is just good to be able to identify the different parts of a URL as we move forward. Cool. All right, thank you very much, everybody. I think I will go back to like normal slides here. All right, we did that. Cool, so we talked about our CRUD actions being create, read, update, and destroy. And these are the actions that we can perform on a resource. And if you think back to some of our lessons from last week, a resource is synonymous with a table in our database. So we can create tasks in our database. We can read by retrieving them, looking at all of them, or looking at a single one of them. We can update a task, we can destroy a task, so on and so forth. And I will pause here just to note like that sometimes the tricky thing with the HTTP verbs versus the CRUD actions is remembering that HTTP verbs have delete and CRUD has destroy. Those two map to each other, but they're different terms. Yeah, it looks like, sorry, let me grab my windows. Looks like we have a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, the resources, I don't feel like I've heard that term before. Could you say that one more time?
Of course. Resource, and we'll have, well, this may appear on other slides, so it might become repetitive, but it's a resource is synonymous with a table in our database. So if you're looking at Task Manager and you're looking to destroy a task, you could say you're destroying a task resource or destroying a record in the task table. So a resource you can think of, another way to put it, let's see, would be an organized set of data where all of the data is of the same type. That would be a resource. So that when you put that in database terminology, you can kind of think of like, oh, all the songs are grouped together because they're all the same type. It's the song resource, it's the song table. And then every row in that table is an instance of the resource. And resource, yeah, it's just a kind of a general term that you can think of with alongside like a table. And resources a little bit, we mention it a lot here in this class because it will come in handy as we start thinking about how routes and how to design our routes file and make that RESTful. As a little bit of a sneak preview or a spoiler alert, we've mentioned before in this project, don't use the resources syntax for your routes. That's kind of where this terminology comes in, and Rails considers there's a way to set up your resources in your routes file that is conventional for Rails. And that's basically what we're talking about today. And we're introducing the term resource as a part of that. So yeah, just to reiterate, I would think of resource as a table in your database. Does that answer your question? I hope that was clear. Thanks.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
No problem. Thanks, Ryan. All right, we'll continue on here. So yeah, HTTP verbs, we talked about get being the HTTP verb that's associated with reading data. So that could be getting a single resource or getting multiple resources, getting instances from your database and showing them. Post is creating data. I remember this one by just thinking about like a bulletin board, and I'm just going to post a new one. When I have something new to add, it's a post. That's what, and post is the verb that we execute when we create data in our database. Patch and put are both updates like we talked about. We are mostly going to be using patch. So good to know about put. And I think we've briefly talked about the difference being that patch changes part of what you're updating and put replaces the whole thing or changes the entire thing, the entire record. Good, yeah, like I said, good to know both of them, but we really only need to worry about patch for the most part right now. And then delete, the HTTP verb delete maps to destroying data. So you would destroy a resource using the delete HTTP verb. Cool. So on to talk about resources in more detail. These are something we have in our application. I think we've touched on this before, but yeah, we just talked about it, but I'll explain it here with the slides again. So we could have tasks, we could have people, we could have movies. These are all examples of resources, and they are collections of data stored in our database. So each row in the table is a specific instance of that resource. So you could have a pets table with 3 rows. That would mean you have 3 pet objects or 3 pet resources stored in your table. And the CRUD refers to the actions we perform on our database. We talked about that a little bit already, but I'll go ahead and put these up here in case anybody's taking notes. Let's see, what's our next slide? Any other questions about resources, CRUD, or HTTP verbs before we move on to talk a little bit more about URIs? Cool. All right, just thought I'd check. Let's move on. URI stands for Uniform Resource Identifier. It's the part of the URL after the domain, like we talked about, up to any query params. We can also think of this as a path if we're thinking in a Rails context. So here's an entire URL, and the URI is going to be the /wiki/uniform_resource_identifier. And it identifies a particular resource. It identifies a noun is kind of how we can think about it. So a URI that is /pets, for example, would signify to us that we're the resource we're dealing with is a collection of pets. It's /pets/ID. We know that we're dealing with a single pet from our database, right? And those are URIs. Let's see. Yeah, we'll keep going. So all that brings us to REST, the actual subject of what we're talking about today. REST stands for Representational State Transfer, and it's a web architecture style. It's a way of organizing and designing our apps. It's best practice for building routes in Rails. So when you come into a new Rails project, the chances are the agreed upon structure of the routes file and the way that all the routes are working and directing is going to be as RESTful as possible. This term was coined by Roy Fielding in 2000, and RESTful applications typically treat the entire web like a resource. So this is kind of a lot of really good background information. Don't necessarily feel like you have to memorize all of these bullet points. This is just kind of some context about what REST is and why we use it. It's really a way to organize interactions between independent systems. And it helps make decisions for us so that when we go into a new project and we're starting to set up our routes file, we don't have to start absolutely from scratch. If we have an idea of what tables we have in our database and what CRUD actions we want our users to be able to take on them, then all of that functionality fits really well into the REST conventional styles and ways of doing things. So like I said, it's a convention. We hear this a lot when we're working on Rails, convention, not configuration, meaning we could create things custom and do it in a completely unique way, but there is a convention in the Rails world of how we just kind of expect to interact with things like routing, MVC, et cetera. So REST is part of that. REST is something that RESTful routes is especially something that we're going to be expecting to see in projects going forward and such. And we use these conventions so that others can understand easily, and there's just less overhead for both like starting up a project and then maintaining it. And really, at the end of the day, this is a map of HTTP, verb, and path combinations and CRUD actions users want to perform on a resource. So we have a few pieces that we've talked about. We've talked about having these resources, which URI we want people to go to, and what action is being taken on what resource. And REST is a way of grouping all of these things together so that our app knows what to do and where. So as these relate to URIs, in RESTful design, URIs do have specific patterns. So here's a generic example of kind of what I'm talking about. If we had a path or a URI that goes /resources, this communicates to us that we are looking for all of a particular resource. If we have /resources/ and then an ID for a resource, that means that we're looking for a specific instance. And here's a more specific example. Let's say that we have a table in our database called dogs. So for a dog resource, we could set up a URI that goes /dogs. Excuse me, I tapped my mic by accident. For all of the dogs, we could do a URI /dogs/4, and that would communicate to us that we're looking for the dog with the ID of 4. So with just the URI, we have the what? We have, like, let's take this last example, the dogs/4. We know we want the dog with the ID of 4. And what we would be missing here if we were building an app is, okay, well, what HTTP verb do we put in front of this? What CRUD action is the user going to take? And it's kind of the whole point of REST. We'll get to more here in a second. Before we move on, I do want to point out the pluralization. This is, I think, a common gotcha. Even if we're retrieving, or yeah, let's say we're retrieving a single resource, the dog with the ID of 4, the path or the URI is still pluralized here. We say dogs, and then we give it the ID for the single resource. So just something to note. We keep the pluralization regardless of how many records we're getting. Cool. So that's the piece with the URIs. Let's move on to REST and HTTP verbs. So in RESTful design, the HTTP verb indicates what you're wanting to do with a resource. So get would be retrieving it. If we had get /dog/4, we would be retrieving that one instance of the dog, of a dog. Post is creating a new resource. So we could say post/dogs, and whatever data we send over with that would be used to create a new dog in our dogs table. Put, like we talked about a second ago, updates an entire resource. Patch updates part of the resource. So we would use patch to maybe update the dog's age. And delete will entirely remove/destroy a resource. So now we're going to put it all together and we'll kind of go through this and then maybe have some time for questions or discussion if any of this doesn't quite make sense. So URI is which resource we're looking to interact with. The HTTP verb is what we want to do with that resource. And then the combination of the verb and the path, the URI, indicates what CRUD action a user wants to take. And these are all known as RESTful routes. That's kind of how they all fit together. And here's an example. So if we say delete/dogs/5, that translates to destroy the dog with the ID of 5. If we say post/dogs, this creates a new dog. If we say get dogs, this shows all the dogs. So you can see here that we have the same URI for both of these second examples. It's both/dogs, and that's what makes the verb so important. One will go get all of them and one will add a new one, and we would likely have both of these defined in our routes file. If we say get/dogs/2, that will show us the dog with the ID of 2. Again, you see that this URI is, other than our wildcard or our variable here, our dynamic ID, we have /dog/ whatever the ID is. One of these is going to delete and one of these is going to get. So we have to have both of those routes set up to have both of those URIs mapped to the functionality that we want. Okay, so we are going to have an exercise to get some hands-on practice with this and matching up the URIs with HTTP verbs, et cetera. But I'll pause here and ask what questions are coming up for y'all. Aiden.
Can you pop back a slide? I had a question on the last slide.
Yeah, absolutely. That would be REST and HTTP verbs. What's up?
Yeah, so would for post create a new resource? I would have thought that would be create a new record, because a resource refers to like a whole table, whereas a record is a row, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. I guess to be very clear here, we could say it creates a new instance of a resource. Yeah, okay. I would say if you were to tell somebody, oh, I'm going to post to this URL and create a new resource, I think people we would understand that you mean I'm entering a new row in that table. But yeah, that's a good point. When typically resource would be synonymous with the table, and we would be posting and creating a new instance of that resource or a new instance of that class, if you think about it as it's happening in Ruby. Does that answer your question?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. I just wanted to make sure my definition of resource was correct.
Yeah, sounds good to me. Cool, thanks. No problem. Ryan.
Yeah, I feel like I'm starting to understand this CRUD and REST, but when, for example, a delete or a post or whatever is going as an HTTP request, it seems that we're looking at that URL, and part of the URL is the query string. Is that information getting transmitted from the URL? Is a query being generated up there and we're just not seeing it? I'm a little confused where that question mark and items get populated.
Yeah, that's a good question. Let's talk briefly about query strings. We probably don't want to go into this in too much detail because it's a little bit separate from the idea of just REST. But when we talk about query strings, so just to reiterate, your question, Ryan, was the query strings, so the stuff after the question mark and up to a pound sign if we have one. You're asking, do these determine anything for us as far as the CRUD actions? Is that?
Yeah, and more or less, I'm never gonna type that into a URL. It's gonna be, this is what's getting generated, right?
Yeah, potentially. So I think what I will say to that is that query query strings are another thing you can add on to your existing path or your existing URI to make adjustments to what the user is going to see. So query params are not directly related to RESTful routes or even the routes file. Query params are something you'll probably be interacting with in the controller. So let's say there are a lot of different ways that query params could work. You could type it out in the browser if you wanted to, but maybe somebody clicks on a button that says, that has some sort of filtering logic. Maybe that's stored in the query params, and then the controller will handle the case of having query params included in the request. So they're optional, and you would not handle them like in the routes file, and they have nothing to do with REST or RESTful routes directly. Does that kind of answer your question, Ryan?
Yeah, it does.
Okay. Yeah, any follow-up to that also? I'm not.
And I can add in a little bit more
Please do,
context here,
Brian.
Jameson. The lesson plan that we worked through, the forms lesson, the very last activity experiments with adding in query params and seeing them in the controller. So go ahead and do that, and that'll make it a little bit more concrete of how you might be able to use them. Yeah.
Okay, I do think that answers a false assumption that I had, that during RESTful routes, that maybe there was some type of query string being automatically added that I didn't see in the case of like, hey, I'm making a new post. So when it feeds into the routes, it's taking with it some type of query, but it's not. It's just using what already exists, and that's a separate subject kind of.
Yeah, I'd say that's right. And thank you, Brian, for that extra context. And Ryan, I think that you're on the right track there. What I'll add to that is when you're sending a post request, everything that is needed for the post is already included in that request. It doesn't need to be added on in query params. That would be like another way of thinking of it.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Andrew, or yeah, I think Andrew S, and then we'll go to Claudia.
Shoot. I almost forgot what my question was. 1 second. Right. So we have all these resources, and we have ways of dealing with them, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if I have something like suppose I have like a database and a bunch of stuff that I'm processing on this app, and I just want a little side thing that says, hey, this is how you use the app, a little page of information or a frequently asked page or some other thing that doesn't have to do with any of the other resources I'm managing. In RESTful development, how do we deal with that if it's not a specific resource? Is there a convention for that, or is it just when it comes to that, you make it whatever you want?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think my guess would be it would largely depend upon the specific. It would be very situational, right? It would depend upon exactly how much you need to build as far as things that aren't related to resources and things like that. We can think of another example of that being like the route path, right? In when you're starting up a new Rails project and you don't have any routes yet, and you just go to localhost 3000, we see that they kind of give us a freebie, right? A landing page for the URI that's just a slash and nothing else, and it says, "Hi, you're on what Rails?" So to your question, Andrew, like maybe you have like a frequently asked questions page or something else where people might need to go to get more information, but it doesn't have anything to do with stuff we're storing in our database, right? My suggestion on that would be to set up the routes and controllers as closely to like almost like it is a resource, but without adding anything in the database for that. So maybe the routes for those types of pages follow a similar structure, but aren't directly related to any CRUD actions. They would just retrieve a view, and that's about it. Is that helpful?
Yeah.
Okay. Claudia.
Yeah, this is hitting kind of at a very specific user story and iteration too for the project. But how would you go about like handling a I guess, a route that has the same URI in terms of like for the HTTP request, how would you handle like a route that needs like 2 of those? So the same route, but different requests. Like, do you have to add something additional to like more than a very like mild case of this, or?
Yeah, so I think what you're getting at, Claudia, and correct me if I'm wrong, is maybe we need to get pet/1 and delete pet/1, and they're the same URI. They have different verbs. Do we need to add anything else for those 2 routes to not conflict? Is that kind of what you're getting at with your question?
Yeah.
Cool. So I'll talk a little bit about that, but I think it'll become clearer as we look at some examples and as we get closer to the end of this lesson. So feel free to circle back on this question if we don't answer it in detail by the end of class. But what I will say is that your routes file is going to be evaluated line by line in sequential order. So it's the order of your routes matters. And maybe you'll have 2 different requests set up in your app. One is to get that URI and one is to delete that URI. And it's up to that request, which we set up elsewhere in the app, to say which one, which method, get or delete. And then, later in the class, we'll talk a little bit more about nested routes, which can come in handy when you have relationships and the routes need to represent something there. But I don't want to get into detail too much because we'll talk about it later in class. Helpful?
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Sure, no problem. Okay, let's see. I think next we do have an exercise. Let me go ahead and pull up that slide, but I think we'll take a palm first. Give me a second here. Okay, yeah, here we are. I think this is about where we were, and it is 11:18. Yeah, let's go ahead and take a palm and come back at 11:23. All right, as people are hopefully making their way back, I have our next activity up here on the slides. We'll be diagramming some of the stuff that we've been talking about with RESTful routes. We're going to switch gears a little bit and look at the task manager example. And we're going to be charting out what the 7 different method, path, controller, and action combinations are. And then we'll be talking about what each one of them does. So an example of what we might diagram out here is get path tasks, and the tasks with that goes to the tasks controller and specifically to the index action in that controller. And in just English, in our own words, what does it do? It shows all the tasks. And there is a template linked in the calendar event. I'll also send that to the chat if I can find my windows. 1 second here. So this is a Google sheet that you can make a copy of if you want. You can also feel free to do this diagram just in like a notebook or something like that. Let me know if anybody has trouble accessing that document. And as an example, this is kind of what we're looking at. So we'll be looking at Task Manager and specifying what HTTP verb is here. And then what the path will be. So the first example here is /tasks, which controller that will map to, what controller action specifically it'll be going to, and then just what does it do? Describe what we're trying to accomplish here. And I'll break you out into the same breakout rooms for about 10-ish minutes, and everybody can work on their own individual copy and just have discussions around that in your breakout room if you'd like. No need for anybody to come up with one diagram for the whole group. This is something that everybody should have a copy of, either in your notebook or as a copy of that Google sheet that I sent to the chat. And then we'll come back and fill out this chart together. Does anybody have questions about the activity before I send you off? Okay, I'm going to open up those breakout rooms now.
yeah, it changes the whole. So we don't actually have a put in any of our projects at this time.
An active record.
No, I'm with you.
Hey y'all, out of curiosity, how are we looking on time? Would like 5 more minutes be a good amount? Or are y'all like done?
We're like done.
Okay, cool. Just checking in. See you in a few.
Yeah,
Seriously.
same.
Hi, just thought I'd check in. Are y'all like how far are you on the exercise? Done? Been done for a few minutes? Need a few more minutes?
I have a question, and we didn't talk about this, but I just found this question in my head. So for like put, when we say like it updates the entire resource, so we mean it updates the entire table. So like a put would be more like useful for like, I want to set all my task titles to be like walk the dog. Rather than like the patch, which would be like, I want to have row 1, like change the title to like clean the dishes.
Yeah, just
Okay.
listening to that sounds like a good way of thinking of it and a good example. That's why we're mostly using patch. Put is, we include it because it is one of the common HTTP verbs, but we aren't going to make a whole lot of use of it because usually we're just looking to update one piece of one thing.
Okay, thank you.
Cool. All right, I'll close the rooms in probably another 3 or 4 minutes. See y'all soon.
Thank you.
hit enter as I was typing into the spreadsheet right when
No.
that message popped up.
Sorry about that.
Oh, Zoom.
All right, welcome back, everybody. Before we go into sharing out what we worked on with diagramming those routes, I wanted to circle back and touch on like a couple of things that I heard coming up in breakout rooms and just clarify. Yeah, I guess the main thing is talking about the terminology of resource and also the put verb. I just want to like clarify a little bit because I'm not sure if the way I explained it was super helpful. When we talk about the word resource, it's pretty common, and this like kind of ties back to questions we had earlier. It's pretty common to hear that as talking about like a single resource or like interchangeably with a record. So I think contextual clues go a long way, or at least they have for me when I think about the terminology of resource. If we say, oh, I'm going to manipulate a task resource with a capital T, we're probably talking about an entire table. But if you hear somebody say, oh, let's destroy that resource, destroy by its nature would destroy a single item or a single row in the database. So that's the first thing. It's I feel like that can be a little bit confusing. But when we talk about a resource, you can just think about something that exists in the database. And depending upon the context, we might be talking about one record, or we could be talking more generically about the whole table or how that kind of data is supposed to behave. The other thing, talking about put, in this diagram exercise, I wouldn't expect anybody to necessarily run into put because we're looking at the routes that we used in Task Manager. And here, I guess this is a good time for me to share my screen. 1 second here, get my windows. And just to kind of reiterate on put will update an entire resource. And this time when I say resource, I mean an entire record. So to send a put request and update one column, it will take that information, but just continue to update all the columns with what already exists there. So that's why patch is generally more useful. We're usually not looking to update every single column in a row. We're looking to update like what's stored in the name column for that particular row, if that makes sense. Jahara, question?
For this activity, and this is kind of out for figuring it out now, but were we supposed to do the one that was linked on the calendar or the one that was linked in the lesson? Because those are two different ones.
Oh yeah, I apologize for that. I think here in the lesson, and I'm glad that you reminded me because I forgot that this was different.
Yep.
This has more information. You can all still see my screen, right? Is this the one you're talking about, Jahara? Yeah. If you did this one, that's totally fine. And I apologize for not clarifying. This slipped my mind. But this is kind of the same thing with more information. So here it's also asking whether the ultimate action would be a redirect or a render. It's asking which view is going to be rendered in the case of a render. And if you did this, that's great. But the focus of today's lesson is really the one that was linked on the calendar, which I think is closer to these columns.
Thank you.
Sure, no problem. And then in the chat, I see Ryan, you asked including ID for put. Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know exactly for sure. I'd probably have to look it up. I would assume that, we're working in Rails. The ID is managed for us. But the idea with put is that it's mostly useful if every single column of a row needs to be updated. And that's why we haven't really used it. Just wanted to clarify on that. I think maybe there can be some confusion about why put could be useful And it's not necessarily to update everything. Like I think one common gotcha is that it sounds like it updates everything in a table. No, it updates everything in the row. It updates that entry in its entirety rather than just updating one value for a column. I saw a hand up, but I missed whose it was. Did somebody have a question before we move on? Yeah, Kevin.
Yeah, I had a general question about the put. So a patch is a smaller update. So if you're doing a put where you're updating everything within that row, is that similar to destroying and creating a new one because you're losing the ID also, or are you still keeping that position even though you're not keeping the ID? If that makes any sense.
It does. And my guess, this is a caveat, this is just a guess, I'm not totally sure. My guess would be the second one because it is just updating the record, but I don't know for sure. I wonder if maybe Brian knows. Brian, do you know if a put would alter the ID in any way of a record?
That's a good question. I would imagine no. Yeah, just because if you're updating the ID, then it's kind of you talked about how the ID identifies a particular resource. So if you're updating the ID, you're almost like changing the resource to a completely different resource. Yeah, typically we just don't ever touch the IDs.
Yep, that makes sense to me. Thanks, Brian. Okay, cool. Let's go ahead and jump into this. I will, for the sake of time, just take some volunteers. Let me get into my edit mode here. Cool. Could somebody raise their hand and walk me through another one of these routes on the diagram? Anybody have one? Aiden, let's hear from you, Aiden.
I'll give it a shot.
Okay.
I'm trying to do like just showing an individual task. So
Okay.
it would be get,
Okay.
and then /tasks/ID. Same controller. The action is show, and it shows a single task.
Yep, that's great. And to add to that, specifically the task with the ID that we specified here, right? Awesome, thank you, Aiden. With given ID, awesome. Alexander?
So if you list it in this order in your routes, then tasks/new would kind of be run under this, correct? Like it's imperative that you list tasks/new before this one.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Yeah, what would happen, I guess, would be the question. I'll return to you. What would happen if we didn't do that? Like, what's a potential bug we could see?
I guess I'm not following your question. Like it would, if instead of going to what you want, the route you want for tasks new, it would just show the task instead of like going to, yeah.
Yeah, and yeah, sorry, I know that was a pretty open-ended question, but yeah, I think that's right. Like your routes file would get confused potentially of which route you mean. And if you go to get tasks new and it hits this route first, it could think that you mean find me a task with the ID of the string new. Right. So yeah, just something to think about. I know we're kind of getting short on time, so I don't want to go into too much detail there. Did somebody else have a hand raised either for a solution here or another question? But yes, to answer your question, Alexander, if that didn't already, order is important. Cool. Let's continue on this chart. Can I get another volunteer? I hate to threaten you all with the randomizer, but I'll call on somebody if I need to. Did anybody else have something here? Keegan? And then I see your hand, Brady, so we'll go to you next.
Sure, we could do get
Okay.
task or / excuse me, tasks / new.
Okay.
task controller is the controller. The action is new. And that's going to show the page or the HTML for creating that new task.
Right. Yeah. And let's see. The way I might phrase this is shows the form for creating a new task. Thank you. Oops. I think we had Brisa and then we had somebody else's hand up, but I forget who, so I'll need you to volunteer again. Brisa, did you have another entry here?
Yeah, so new and create kind of come in pairs. So we're gonna do post for the verb.
Okay.
And then the path is gonna be /tasks, controller, task, action, create, and it creates a new record.
Yep, exactly. Thank you, Brisa. And to kind of elaborate on what you were saying, Brisa, about having a new and a create going hand in hand. If you did happen to look at this chart, with a create, we wouldn't be rendering anything necessarily, right? Typically, we'd see a redirect after that. We don't have anything to show after we've created a record. We would get the form for the new, and then we would post we would post in order to create, and then we would probably do like a redirect to index or something like that, right? Okay, cool. Just a little tidbit there. Can anyone else share for this next one? Or did anybody have questions? I do feel like I saw another hand up. Ryan?
I could try the next one.
Let's take a stab at it.
So if what I want to do is see a form to edit, that would be a get method. And it would be tasks. I believe it would be the ID. And then maybe edit.
Yep, looks good to me. And then that would go to
the tasks controller. And then the action, I think, would still be edit.
Okay. And then what does this do?
This would give me a form to that would be populated with existing information that I could change.
So the way that I would probably say that and the way I've typed it out here is it's showing the form for updating the task with the given ID. Whether or not it is pre-populated that can be changed, but we would always expect your edit action to show a form that would allow you to update that record, right? Very good, thank you. I'm gonna have to make this a little smaller for my own preferences there. Okay, cool. Joe, I see your hand. Question or addition to this chart?
Yeah, I'll go after Patch since it did me in last time. For this one, Patch.
Patch, sorry. I was about to...
Yeah, you're good.
Okay.
And then for the path, /task/ID. And then task pounder hashtag update.
Yep. So that'd be the task controller, and then the action would be update. Yep. What does this one do?
Updates whatever that ID that you're calling on, updates whatever that record is.
Yeah, exactly. So updates the task with the given ID. So yeah, exactly. Very similar to our new and create. Our edit and update will have a get request first in order to display the form to collect the information from the user. And then when we click submit for the edit case, this patch will be submitted with that request and it will update the task with the given ID. Very cool. We have one more. Any volunteers for the last route to put into this chart? Ksenia?
We'll try delete. We're going to go to tasks ID. Task controller. It's going to be destroy.
Yep.
And it's going to delete the whole task record.
Yep, the task with the given ID, right?
And I have a question.
Okay, shoot.
So for get, we're saying that action is edit, and I guess, correct me if I'm wrong, so like if we're following CRUD convention, right, we have like 4 actions: create, read, update, and delete. Is edit an action, or would it be update? Or am I just making this up?
That's a good question. What I'll point out is for CRUD, we have create, read, update, destroy, which is kind of the confusing piece where our HTTP verb is delete, but our CRUD action is destroy. So you'll notice we have a get for edit and we have a get for new. New and edit aren't really terms that we think of as part of CRUD. They're not terms that we think of as part of the HTTP verbs, but we need them in our application in order to know what to create or what to update with. These allow us to get input from our user, which is why we need it to be a get. Really what we're doing is we're getting a page where they can enter in that information. And then when they click submit for an, let's see, let me think very carefully about how I want to say this. So let's take the new example. We get tasks new and they're presented with a form. They fill in that information. And then when the user clicks submit on that form, they're submitting a post request, which is the HTTP verb. And then what that is doing is it's creating something in the database, which is the CRUD action. So when that first preliminary step in creating something new for the user is we have to get a form. We have to go to the new form. And that would be, if we think about the what the CRUD action would be here, or the CRUD term, it would be a read, right? Because we're reading the form until we get to the point where the user clicks submit and posts something, we're still reading. We're still getting. Does that kind of clear things up a little bit? Or
Yes. Yeah, so we have 4 CRUD actions, but the actions we're talking about is like what goes after the pound in our routes.
Yeah, that's another good way to think of it. One thing to point out, though, is that is also convention, right? We could have actions in our controller called whatever we want. But yeah, you are often going to have those CRUD actions in your controller just because that's a big part of what we do in our applications, right? We're likely going to have a create action and a destroy action and an update action, but then we don't really have a read action if you think about that, right? We haven't seen read in our controller, but we do see like index, that would be a read action. So there's a lot of overlap in these terms, but they're not all inherently the same thing.
Got it, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, yeah, I want to keep moving because there are a couple other things that we should touch on today. But hopefully we'll have time for any other questions at the end. So here's our diagram. Definitely good to have on hand if you went out into your breakout room and made your own copy. If not, I would encourage you to make your own copy or maybe think about what this would look like for set list so far. But moving on, what would an example be of a not RESTful route? Sometimes we do need to create routes that don't fit perfectly into the RESTful framework. And an example might be we have an app that handles merchants and items, and maybe we want to deactivate an item. So we could use patch and we could go to item/ID and just do kind of what we think of as an ordinary update. And just some things to think about. Would this conflict with a regular update? I think there are situations where maybe it would not conflict and you could use this RESTful route, or maybe it does conflict for some reason. Maybe we're not really looking to do a traditional update. You could create a route called patch/item/ID/deactivate, and that wouldn't be a RESTful route because at this point we'd be adding in kind of our own custom routes that don't necessarily mean anything to anybody else outside of the world of our app. You could do patch items ID toggle. So anytime somebody were to hit or send a patch request to that URI, it could either toggle the item to be activated or deactivated. Also, that would be another example of a non-RESTful route. In general, these are bound to happen at some point in your career, and the goal is just to try to keep things as RESTful as we possibly can. So occasionally there might be a situation where you really truly do need a custom route and it is not RESTful, but just keeping in mind that REST is a convention that helps other people just know what's going on in our app, and it's a convention that we can count on when working on Rails apps by and large, or apps that adhere to REST. So those are just a couple of examples of non-RESTful routes. There could be others, but let's move on and talk about something else that I think will probably come in handy for projects. Sometimes you'll need nested routes, and that could come into play when you have a resource that is a child of another resource. And maybe we want to have a route that specifically goes to, like in this case, only the pets that belong to a certain shelter. So I will leave this slide up for like a minute and just think to yourselves, how would you define a route for this user story? As a user, when I visit the shelter show page, then I click on all pets at this shelter, then I am taken to an index page which shows all the pets for the given shelter. So I will just put something up here on the next slide. I could get my focus right. There we go. So what this might look like with a nested route would be to, there are a couple of routes involved here. So the first route would be when I visit the shelter show page. And the route that I would define there would be get shelters/ID to shelters show. And this is kind of in line with what we just, the exercise we just did for Task Manager. Then I click on all pets at the shelter. Then I am taken to an index page, which shows all the pets for the given shelter. That could look something like get shelters/shelter ID. Remember, this is dynamic. So this would be very similar to the other route that we have defined right above it, /pets. And then you see we could have a custom controller action that goes to pets. That's just one example of how we could use a route that is nested. It's nested because we are displaying, or we are retrieving, or we are doing something with a resource that belongs to another resource. And we're demonstrating that in our route definition by giving the parent, putting the parent in the URI and also specifying the parent ID. So that's an example of a nested route. I put in another example here just to try to reiterate. So here's another example. As a user, when I visit the artist show page, then I click on all songs by this artist. Then I am taken to a page which shows all the songs only for the given artist. So kind of like we had shelters and pets. Oh, I missed a slash here, but this URI could be get /artist/artist ID /songs. And then our application would handle returning the songs that are related only to that artist. And we would have that information available to us because we put this artist ID in our route. Question, Aiden?
Yeah, just regarding ID and artist ID, those would both be representing the same integer. But is this like, would the second route here work if it was just ID still?
It would, and maybe I can expand on that a little bit. So we could absolutely have just this to communicate that this is the artist ID, this is the artist ID, these are the same thing. But as you probably learned or may remember from the dynamic routing class, this is just a placeholder. And this is going to be the key in our, when we get to the controller and we take a look at our params hash, the key here would be called ID. But then if I put artist ID here, then if I were to get into a binding.pry in my controller and look at my params object, the key would be artist ID, and then the value would be whatever the integer is. And the reason that that can be valuable or even conventional is what if eventually we want to scope this down to artists, artist ID, songs, and then go to a specific song for that artist. Well, then we can just use ID. And here, that way, when we're in that, when we're looking at that params hash, we have some differentiation between which song is, or which value is the artist ID and which value is the song ID. Does that answer your question, or is that helpful?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say, as far as I understand, this would be the convention. If you have a parent, then you specify in your routes file, you would define this as parent_ID, and then whichever resource you're manipulating within the nested route of that parent, you could just say songs/ID, and ID would be whichever resource you're directly manipulating, which in this case would be the song. We're looking at songs that belong to a specific artist, according to our routes. Cool. Yeah, that's just an extra slide. Very briefly, if you need to go, it's 12. Feel free to go ahead and hop off. Would very much appreciate it if you all would leave some feedback in the survey for this class. The other thing I wanted to just at least show was namespace routes. This is not something that you absolutely need to know, but something you may see out in the wild. Namespacing has to do with how the controllers are organized. So when you have a controller that maybe has a directory, or you have a set of controllers organized in a directory, for example, maybe there are 3 controllers that you only want administrators to have access to. Those could be grouped in an admin folder, app controllers admin, and then you have the controllers underneath there. And the way that you would communicate this to the routes file would be to use a namespace. Or that would be a way that you could communicate this to your routes file, would be to use a namespace. So that way we say in our routes file, namespace admin do, and then all these routes within here are expected to route to a controller within the admin directory. This is additional information, nice to know. So if it doesn't completely make sense yet, that's completely fine. And again, and I know we're over time, but I'm available for another few minutes if anybody has any final questions before we break. Ksenia?
Would you please post the slides on our channel?
Yeah, will do.
Thank you.
Andrew?
I have a really weird question.
Okay, great. Let's hear it.
If I have like the colon ID or colon whatever, that can mean like anything. And it can be any letter or any number. Well, what if I have a situation where I have a path and I want the next thing to either be like a letter or a number? And if it's a number, I want it to do one thing. And if it's a letter, I want it to do a different thing. But ID takes either one and can't distinguish them. Is there a way to like have like a colon whatever that is smarter than just takes anything, that like specifies it needs to take a certain kind of thing?
In your routes, not that I know of, like in literally in your routes.rb file, not that I know of. Part of the DSL, or the domain specific language of the routes file, is that when you have a colon before something inside the route, that's kind of like saying the value here could be anything, and this is what I'm going to call it in the key value pair. What I will say is, if you get to a point where you are manipulating that params hash, maybe in a controller, or maybe you've passed that onto a model, then you can handle your conditional logic there depending upon what value you got in for that part of the route. What I will say is typically dynamic routing is usually used for IDs, so I wouldn't necessarily expect like a random string to come in as a part of that key value pair in the params object. I would expect that to just handle IDs for different resources, and that's part of RESTful convention. If you were, I would say, and it's possible that maybe this isn't everybody's experience, but I would say if you had a route that had a dynamic value like that, and you were passing it a string instead of like an ID, I would consider that not RESTful. Did that answer your question?
Yes, I think it did.
Okay, cool. Ryan.
Yeah, I'll try to stay on topic. As far as the RESTful routes, so that very last one where we did artist and then like songs. So songs is going to be in the controller as a method. And that's not going to be one of the like original RESTful methods, but does it still fall under the category of RESTful because it's just drawing that direct relation to the songs table? And also, since you changed that like ID by convention, you changed it to song ID or artist ID instead of ID, how it was before. Does that mean in your method, you're not going to call params ID anymore. You're going to call params artist ID, just because I've gotten so used to it always being ID.
Yeah, exactly. So I'll answer the second part of your question first. That's correct. If you're in your controller and you're looking with that specific route example, you're looking to identify the artist, you would say artist.find params artist ID, because now you've replaced in your route what is essentially going to turn into the key of the key value pair in your params hash. And then if you were to do params ID with that example, you'd actually be looking at the song ID. And it's really important to be able to understand how this dynamic routing works so that you can grab the correct ID in the controller, because I think a very common gotcha is to be used to typing params ID and just grabbing whatever params ID is rather than what you think params ID is. So that's part of why like these RESTful conventions are so helpful, because it just kind of always follows a pattern, and you can know what to expect when you're adding a new route or changing routes and stuff. The first part of your question, actually, could you repeat that really quickly?
Just is it like the fact that you called it songs?
Yeah.
That follows the convention of RESTful, or because it's out of the scope of the normal like 7 methods, it doesn't really matter?
There are probably as many opinions on that as there are like developers who use REST, but I would consider it conventional because it, like you said, it denotes the relationship between the parent and the child. I guess if you wanted to be really, really a stickler about the conventions, you could call the action, instead of calling it songs, you could call it something like songs index, and that might be considered more RESTful. I think for our purposes, as long as it's clear what your nested route is doing and why it's a nested route, just by looking at it like, oh yeah, this is going to the artist songs, I think we would consider that RESTful for our purposes. Cool. I'm going to go ahead and call it. Sorry for keeping you all late. This went a little bit longer than I expected, but any follow-up questions, if you post them in the Code Help channel, we'll be happy to answer. Have a good afternoon, everybody.